threats to religious liberty in America are unfortunately nothing new. From the Blaine Amendments that sprung up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to prohibit the use of government funds at sectarian schools, and which, by the way, are in force to some extent in 37 states today, to a recent New York City rule that bars churches, and only churches, from renting public schools on weekends for worship services, there's long been a tension between faith and the government. Recently, we've seen this come into play when the free exercise of religion required by the First Amendment bumps up against what many people view as other important freedoms, like the freedom for same-sex couples to adopt or the so-called reproductive freedom we see touted by those who support unrestricted legal abortion. I'd like to talk about a number of those tension points other than the HHS mandate and how they threaten religious liberty. First of all, Catholic charitable organizations have been pushed out of certain ministries because they have refused to compromise their beliefs. Last year, Catholic Charities in Illinois was forced to stop providing adoption services after providing adoption and foster care services for over 100 years because of new state legislation that would force it to provide adoption services to same-sex couples. The Diocese of Rockford, Illinois, had actually asked for an amendment to the law that would have allowed Catholic Charities to refer unmarried cohabiting couples, both same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples, to other agencies. So they would have been provided a service at another agency, but without violating the Catholic Charities' Catholic faith. That amendment failed. Catholic Charities in Massachusetts, San Francisco, and in D.C. also had to shut down their adoption services because of new requirements that they placed children with same-sex couples. Contrast this with Virginia and North Dakota, which actually get a gold star in this area. Virginia this April enacted a conscience clause protecting religiously affiliated adoption programs. This clause prohibits any private agency from being forced to perform, assist, counsel, recommend, consent to, refer, or participate in any placement of a child for foster care or adoption where the proposed placement would violate the agency's written or moral convictions or policies. So that's just one area where, and this is actually, we've been talking a little bit about women and how these things affect women. There are a lot of women out there who are looking to expand their families through adoption, and this is a huge issue and one that's close to my heart because it's a big deal for couples who have experienced infertility. They turn to adoption agencies, and if Catholic Charities in various states can't provide adoption services, there are fewer places for these families to turn. In the context of sex trafficking, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops used to have a contract to provide services to victims of sex trafficking. Between 2006 and 2011, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Migration and Refugee Services had received $13.9 million in federal funds to assist these victims, but they had a provision in their contract that said that the funds shall not be used to provide referral for abortion services or contraceptive materials pursuant to this contract. So rather than providing funding for contraceptives or abortions for victims, Migration and Refugee Services was providing comprehensive case management services to survivors, including medical and mental health services. But in 2011, the Department of Health and Human Services decided we're not going to renew the contract with the bishops. Why? Because the bishops didn't want to refer for abortions or provide contraceptives to victims of sex trafficking. The Washington Post reported that the department's leadership actually overruled its own staff members who wanted to continue the grant to the bishops. And in March of this year, in response to a lawsuit that the ACLU brought against HHS in 2009, a federal district judge ruled that the grants to the bishops violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which is just actually pretty crazy. The judge said that HHS violated the Establishment Clause because it delegated authority to a religious organization to impose religiously based restrictions on the expenditure of taxpayer funds, thereby impliedly endorsed the religious beliefs of the USCCB and the Catholic Church. So basically, now, the way that it stands, after this lawsuit, which has been appealed, thankfully, and after the HHS decided to just go ahead and drop the contract, if the Catholic Church wants to help victims of sex trafficking, which we do, this is a hugely important issue, it has to violate its beliefs opposing abortion and contraception. The wrinkle here is that in both the adoption examples and in the anti-sex trafficking work, the church was receiving money from the government. So some people might argue that no one is forcing us to violate our conscience. We could just decline to receive the money from the government. They say it's just that if the Catholic Church wants government funds, the Catholic Church has to abide by government rules. But Anthony Piccarello, who's the general counsel for the bishops, points out that Catholics are being excluded from government contracts specifically because of our beliefs. And he says, even though it's true that the church doesn't have a First Amendment right to have a government contract, it does have a First Amendment right not to be excluded from a contract on the basis of our religious beliefs. So we're facing a situation where the church and potentially other religious charities can continue to be forced out of charitable work, where we have great expertise and where we've done significant good in the past, because we won't violate our conscience. The government is basically saying it's my way or the highway when it comes to giving grants for charitable work. Another area that is a big deal right now is immigration laws. And I think that it's important to talk about this because so many of the threats to religious liberty right now are coming from the left. When we talk about things that have to do with marriage and family, when we talk about things that have to do with abortions and contraceptives, those are generally threats from the left. But these immigration laws have been a threat from the right. And as Catholics, we're not partisan. We're Catholic, and that's what we should be first. And so no matter where politically a threat is coming from, we should be prepared, stand ready to fight against that threat. Several states have passed strict anti-immigration laws that could threaten Catholics and other Christians' ability to carry out Christ's commands, as Gail discussed, to do things like feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, and clothe the naked. The best known of these laws are in Arizona and Alabama, but Georgia, Utah, South Carolina, and Indiana have passed similar highly restricted laws, and other states are currently considering them. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops filed a friend of the court brief with the U.S. Supreme Court opposing the Arizona law, and a decision on that law could come down as soon as tomorrow. Maybe. I hope we have an interesting decision tomorrow. We'll see. Obviously, that decision will have widespread implications for similar laws in other states. But I'd like to talk about the Alabama law, which appears to be even harsher than the Arizona law, if that seems possible. The Alabama law makes it a crime for Alabama residents to harbor, conceal, or transport undocumented immigrants or induce them to come into the state. It makes it illegal to rent property to undocumented people, and it changes contract law, prohibiting state courts from recognizing or enforcing contracts between an undocumented immigrant and any other resident if the second party is aware of the immigrant's unauthorized status. There are a few exceptions, which include food purchases, medical services, and taking an immigrant back to where he came from. In Alabama, the Archbishop of Mobile and the Bishop of Birmingham joined with Episcopal and Methodist bishops in suing to block the law. They say that the contract provision of the law interferes with church thrift stores, church daycares, housing and healthcare operations, and prohibits them from performing marriages, baptisms, and providing counseling services to families. They also say that they fear the law may go so far as to make it illegal for churches to administer the sacraments to illegal immigrants, because the law is unconstitutionally vague in defining what constitutes a violation, what the penalties are, and what activities are exempt. It fails to define the terms that it uses, like concealing, harboring, and unauthorized. So would it be illegal, for example, to drive someone to Mass? Would it be illegal to would it be an encouragement of them to come into the state if you're providing some sort of services for them? It's not clear. It's not entirely clear whether law enforcement officials in Alabama or these other states will actually prosecute religious believers for assisting illegal immigrants for providing basic Christian charity. The language of the statute just isn't sufficiently clear. But where the language of a statute is unclear, courts that are interpreting the statute will often look behind the language at the legislative history of the statute to see what those people who wrote the statute intended to do. And the legislative history is actually instructive in this case. When the bill was first introduced, its author did not allow for any religious exemptions. And then an amendment was later introduced to prevent the criminalization of certain religious activities. In May, the amendment passed in the Senate, and the bill was forwarded to the House with the amendment included. But when the bill reappeared, the religious exemption was stricken from it. And that is the bill that was ultimately approved. So you had no religious exemption, an exemption get approved, it was taken back out, and the law was passed. So a court interpreting this legislative history could reasonably conclude that because the Alabama legislature considered and then rejected a religious exemption, it did intend to criminalize religious charity to illegal immigrants. And like I said, it's important that we speak out as Catholics against these immigration laws because they're evidence that threats from religious liberty can come from both sides of the aisle. Opposition to these laws demonstrates that we Catholics are not engaged in some sort of partisan bickering. That's been said a lot about the Fortnight for Freedom, that this is the bishops just opposing President Obama. This is the bishops supporting the Republican candidates. But we are not, as Catholics, the Republican Party at prayer. We will stand up against threats to religious liberty no matter where they come from. There's no question that our immigration system is horribly broken, but imposing harsh laws that infringe on acts of basic Christian charity and maybe even our priests' ability to administer the sacraments without checking someone's legal status is not the way to fix the system.